One word describes this college football playoff experience for this Oregon Ducks program and fan base: frustration. Welcome to that show out west for that team out west, an unbiased, neutral observer's view of Oregon Ducks football. I'm Ted LeBrew. Boy, it has been an interesting December and then moving into January. You know, I'm sitting back on the couch. I am watching these college football playoff semifinals, specifically that Cotton Bowl, specifically that semifinal featuring the Ohio State Buckeyes and the Texas Longhorns. And I'm looking at how Texas is defending Ohio State, how they're playing two deep safeties, how they're keeping everything in front of them, how they're playing off coverage. And the first thing I think to myself as it pertains to viewing this thing through the Oregon lens is, man, that is very, very frustrating, because it was very clear that if you can keep the home run ball in check against Ohio State, you can certainly have success on the defensive side of the football. And that's exactly what happened with Texas and how close they were able to keep that game in the semifinals against the Ohio State Buckeyes. And it really highlights the frustrations towards the end of the season for this Oregon Ducks program, the defensive side of the football. Now, this isn't just, even though this commentary is mostly going to be based within the world and the timeline of the college football playoff, you got to go back to the first Saturday in December, and that's where some of the frustrations on defense started to come about. The last two games of the season, the Big Ten championship game against Penn State, and of course that Rose Bowl playoff quarterfinal against Ohio State, combined, this Ducks defense gave up 1,023 total yards to the Nittany Lions and the Buckeyes. Of course, in that Big Ten championship game, over 500 yards, 523 yards to be exact, given up to the Nittany Lions. They rushed for nearly 300 yards on the ground. And then you look at what Penn State's offense has been in the college football playoff, playing B games the entire way through. Once again, we come back to frustrating. And then you see what Texas's defense was able to do against Ohio State in the semifinals and how confident their game plan was. Confident defense, those were certainly things that Oregon was not. I kind of rewatched some of those big scoring plays in the Rose Bowl, and Oregon was utterly confused at the beginning of all of them, right? They were able to see what Ohio State did on film against Tennessee and what they wanted to do from explosiveness standpoint. And of course, we all know what happened in the Rose Bowl game. It was very frustrating to watch Texas play defensive football against Ohio State in that national semifinal. But I will say this. I think the Texas Longhorns had the benefit of looking at not only one example of film in that Tennessee game, but a second example of film in that Oregon game to see what they needed to do to be able to keep this offense in check, what they needed to be able to do to keep Jeremiah Smith in check. How about one catch for 3 yards? That is mind-boggling what they were able to do. But I think when I look at this, because that's the thing where Oregon had that 12-0 regular season, where they were defeating teams considerably throughout the regular year. And I was kind of looking at this thing, and at the end of the regular season, Oregon was coming off of a performance against Washington where they whooped up on the Huskies, right? This is a Washington team that ended up 6-6. Okay, this was a Washington team that was 6-5 when the Ducks played them. They had 10 sacks. We all know the story of that rivalry game against the Huskies. You know who else was 6-5? The Michigan Wolverines when they played the Ohio State Buckeyes, and we all know what happened. The fire that was lit by Michigan's victory over the Ohio State Buckeyes in that game. I thought at that point in time, Oregon was certainly the team to beat in that particular situation, but the defense, and you kind of look at it throughout the season. You look at how the defense performed earlier in the year against Boise State, giving up 34 points, a last-second field goal needed to defeat the Broncos. I know the Ducks were certainly still kind of figuring things out at that moment in time, so you got to take that into consideration as well. Giving up 31 points to Ohio State, and we mentioned the Penn State games. We mentioned the second Ohio State games. I think overall, this is an Oregon defense that needs to continue to be better. I thought this was a really good defensive season for the Oregon Ducks. I think that they can step up and have a great defensive season. I think they can step up and have an elite defensive season at some points down the road. This is still a team that is getting better players, specifically in the secondary. They've recruited so well, maybe as good as any team in college football in the secondary over the past 2 seasons. And that's specifically a group that we need to see take steps forward to avoid what happened in the Pac-12 championship game last year against Washington, to avoid what happened in the Rose Bowl game against Ohio State this year, to avoid those types of frustrations. And then I'm looking at the other side of the bracket. I'm watching the Penn State Nittany Lions. Wait a minute, let me rewind the tape a little bit. Didn't I just talk about Oregon defeating Penn State in the Big Ten championship game? Yet how did this all play out in the end in the college football playoff bracket? Oregon, undefeated season, 13-0, first team in Big Ten history to beat Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan State ever. A historic season when you've got a lot of parity and this team beating that team and that team beating this team, and you have a team as talented as, say, like an Ohio State losing 2 games over the course of the season. And then you have a team at the top in the Oregon Ducks. They get the number 1 seed. What is their reward? You get a pissed off Ohio State team after that loss to Michigan, after tens of thousands of Tennessee fans come into their stadium and try to take over. That's your reward on New Year's Day in the Rose Bowl. The loser of that Big Ten championship game, the Penn State Nittany Lions, what was their path to the college football playoff semifinals, you may ask? SMU at home and Boise State. Now, obviously, I'm going to come on here and say Oregon played a bad football game. That is completely obvious to anybody who watched the Rose Bowl. And Dan Lanning said it in the lead up to the Rose Bowl. He didn't make, this is paraphrasing, but he basically said, to be the man, you got to beat the man. You got to be willing to take on all comers. He wasn't complaining about the format, maybe like I'm doing right now, right? He was saying, bring one, bring them all. To be the national champion, you have to go through the best. And that's why I love Dan Lanning in charge of this program, because he's got that killer mentality. He's got that mindset that you need to be able to play at that level with those types of teams anytime, whether it's January 1st or whether it's January 20th. But it is frustrating to see Oregon have this great season, to get the number 1 seed, only to draw what might be the most talented team in the country in the quarterfinals. It is frustrating to see the team that they beat in Indianapolis, in Penn State, draw the path that they did to the college football playoff semifinals. It kind of makes you go back and think, if Oregon comes up on the short end of the stick in the Big Ten championship game, however that happens, they get a home game at Autzen against SMU. They go to a neutral site against Boise State in a rematch. No question about it. This Oregon team is playing in the college football playoff semifinals. And they got 2 wins under their belt going into what would have been a game against the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Now, Notre Dame is a very, very good football team. Who knows? We'll never know certainly how that game ended up. But it doesn't change the feeling. It doesn't change the fact that the way this playoff format and the way this has kind of all played out from start to finish, it is frustrating for the Oregon football program, and it is frustrating maybe more for the Oregon football fans out there. We know that there is a big flaw in the system in terms of seeding, in terms of how this bracket is set up. The number one victim was the Oregon Ducks. So it kind of makes you wonder on that last regular season weekend if Ohio State was able to pull this thing out against Michigan. The beatdown probably happens in Indianapolis, or maybe it's not as big of a beatdown as it was in the Rose Bowl. And now Ohio State is the number 1 seed. Oregon is the 5 or the 6. Maybe Penn State drops down to the 7. And that's another path for Oregon to get to the national semifinals. And once you have, I think this year kind of proved a lot. Once you're able to build up that momentum at the end of the season, that's where you're able to really hit your stride and get together as a college football playoff team. I know there's been a lot of frustration, and I did not cover that on this channel, so I wanted to make sure that I covered it in this commentary. But here's the great thing about frustration, is Dan Lanning is going to be able to bottle that for the returning guys coming back next season. He's going to plaster it on the wall. He's going to plaster it in the weight room. And this year, the Oregon Ducks were the victim. Next year, maybe Oregon Ducks will be the beneficiary of the system. There's 2 sides to this sword. We'll see if the Ducks can be the ones slicing through the 2025 and 2026 version of the college football playoff. I think frustration is going to be turned into motivation this offseason. I cannot wait to see the type of hype videos we see from Scott Anderson and company when all of that is kind of bottled up and put into these great hype packages that we know this Oregon video and creative staff is known for. Those are my thoughts on the situation. What are your thoughts into what have you been thinking, kind of watching this college football playoff all go down and all take place? It was sure frustrating to see the great defensive game plan that Texas had compared to the defensive game plan that the Oregon Ducks had. Leave all of that in the comments below. I'm Ted LaRue. This has been That Show Out West.